Imagine this, you've just said "I do" to your beloved in a dusty frontier town in 1870s Colorado. The preacher closes his Bible, the small crowd disperses, and reality hits. There's no honeymoon suite, no wedding gifts, and your new spouse might be a complete stranger you met through a newspaper advertisement just weeks ago. The romantic notion of frontier love quickly crumbles when faced with the brutal truth. Marriage in the Wild West wasn't about romance, but survival, where wives became property, and till death do us part often arrived within months rather than decades. Today we examine the harsh realities of matrimony on the American frontier, where love was a luxury few could afford. From newspaper bride advertisements promising false hope to women bleeding to death in remote cabins during childbirth, these are the deadly realities of Wild West marriages. Starting with courtship. The art of romance died a swift death on the American frontier, replaced by a cold marketplace where husbands and wives were bought and sold through newspaper columns. Desperate men scattered across isolated territories turned to publications like the Matrimonial News, paying $25 for the privilege of corresponding with women they would never meet before marriage. These advertisements read like livestock auctions. Wanted: healthy woman of good character, age 18 to 25, for marriage to prosperous rancher. Must be willing to work and bear children. No fancy ladies need apply. Women responded with equal pragmatism, describing their cooking abilities and physical strength rather than their heart's desires. Eleanor Pruitt discovered this harsh reality in 1909 when she arrived in Wyoming to marry Clyde Stewart, a man she knew only through 3 brief letters. The train deposited her at a desolate station where Stewart waited with a preacher and 2 witnesses. Within an hour of their first handshake, they were husband and wife. No courtship, no romance, no time to discover whether they could even tolerate each other's company. The deception ran both ways. Men sent photographs from their younger, more prosperous days, omitting mentions of debt, drinking problems, or violent tendencies. Women padded their letters with fabricated domestic skills and concealed ages, illnesses, or children from previous relationships. These lies often remained buried until the wedding night, when reality struck with devastating force. The correspondence services thrived on this desperation. Entrepreneurs established entire networks connecting Eastern women fleeing poverty with Western men starving for companionship. The women embarked on weeks-long journeys across the continent, carrying everything they owned in a single trunk, traveling toward an uncertain future with a complete stranger. Some brides arrived at their destination only to discover their intended husbands had died, abandoned their claims, or simply changed their minds. Stranded thousands of miles from home with no money for return passage, these women faced impossible choices: marry whoever would have them, work in saloons, or perish in the wilderness. The lucky ones found men who honoured their written promises. The unlucky majority discovered that survival took precedence over every romantic notion they had harboured. Love became a luxury that few frontier marriages could afford, replaced by the more practical considerations of who could chop wood, birth livestock, and endure the endless isolation of prairie life. This systematic elimination of courtship transformed marriage from a union of hearts into a business transaction, where compatibility meant little and endurance meant everything. Economics. Marriage on the frontier functioned as the ultimate business merger, where women became assets transferred from father to husband in a transaction that determined survival or death. The romantic notion of partnership evaporated under the brutal reality that wives possessed no economic identity beyond their husband's property ledger. A woman's labour, earnings, and possessions instantly belonged to her spouse the moment she spoke her wedding vows. This economic enslavement created a suffocating dependence that trapped countless women in nightmarish situations with no escape route. The Parker family's struggle in Kansas during 1874 illustrated this harsh reality with devastating clarity. Mary Parker rose before dawn each morning to tend her chickens, collecting eggs that she sold to passing travellers for precious coins. Her entrepreneurial spirit generated enough income to purchase winter supplies and medicine for their sick children. Yet every penny legally belonged to her husband Thomas, who spent Mary's earnings on whiskey and gambling while their children went hungry. When Mary confronted Thomas about squandering her hard-earned money, he reminded her with brutal efficiency that she owned nothing: her chickens, her labour, her future, all existed at his discretion. The woman who woke at 4 each morning to build their survival had no legal claim to the fruits of her relentless work. The Homestead Act created an additional layer of economic imprisonment for married women. While single women could claim land independently, marriage instantly disqualified them from ownership. Wives who had worked tirelessly to build homesteads discovered they possessed no legal claim to the property their sweat and blood had created. Dowries in the West consisted of livestock, farming tools, or meagre cash savings that families scraped together to make their daughters attractive to potential husbands. These humble offerings often represented years of sacrifice, yet they disappeared into the husband's estate the moment the preacher pronounced them married. Economic desperation drove women into hasty marriages with dangerous strangers. Widows with children faced impossible choices between starvation and marrying men who viewed them as unpaid labourers. The frontier's harsh economics eliminated the luxury of choice, forcing women to accept proposals from alcoholics, violent men, or anyone willing to prevent their immediate death from exposure and hunger. This financial powerlessness extended beyond individual marriages to create a system where women's economic contributions remained invisible, despite their essential role in frontier survival. They generated income through cooking, cleaning, childcare, and countless other services, yet possessed no legal recognition or compensation for their labour. The economic realities of frontier marriage transformed wives into indentured servants with lifetime contracts, where escape meant certain death and compliance offered only the slim hope of survival. Isolation. The vast emptiness of the American frontier transformed marriage into a psychological prison, where husbands and wives became each other's sole human contact for months at a time. Homestead claims stretched across enormous distances, creating islands of desperate humanity, separated by miles of merciless prairie that might as well have been oceans. This crushing isolation drove countless frontier wives into madness, a condition territorial doctors grimly labelled prairie fever. The endless horizon and deafening silence broke minds that had never experienced such complete separation from human civilization. Martha Morrison's daily existence in Nebraska during 1883 revealed the soul-destroying reality of frontier isolation. Her nearest neighbour lived 12 miles away, across treacherous terrain that became impassable during winter storms. Martha's diary entries chronicled her descent into despair, as days stretched into weeks without seeing another human face besides her husband's weathered features. On day 23 of her isolation, Martha wrote about talking to her chickens as if they were old friends from back east. By day 35, she had begun setting places at the dinner table for imaginary visitors, carrying on elaborate conversations with empty chairs, while her bewildered husband watched her sanity crumble. The 45th day marked Martha's complete break from reality. She penned frantic letters to her sister in Pennsylvania, describing tea parties with elegant ladies and social gatherings that existed only in her fractured mind. Her husband found her standing in their empty cabin, curtsying and chatting with phantom guests while the wind howled through the prairie grass outside. Communication with family back east moved at an agonizingly slow pace, with letters taking weeks or months to reach their destinations. Women desperate for connection with their former lives would wait months for responses that might never come, watching the horizon each day for mail carriers who appeared like mirages in the distance. The psychological burden fell heaviest on wives who had abandoned thriving social networks in eastern cities for the promise of Western opportunity. These women found themselves trapped with husbands who often proved to be strangers, forced to depend on men they barely knew for every conversation, every moment of human interaction, every connection to sanity. Winter months intensified this torment as blizzards sealed families inside cramped cabins for weeks at a time. Couples discovered that sharing a single room with no escape created pressure that exploded into violence or madness. The romantic notion of cozy winter evenings by the fire collapsed under the reality of being trapped with another person's breathing, eating, and bodily functions in a space smaller than most modern closets. This isolation created marriages where spouses either formed unbreakable bonds forged by shared suffering, or destroyed each other through the relentless pressure of forced companionship with no relief. Violence. The frontier's isolation created a nightmarish reality where domestic violence flourished without consequence, transforming marriages into death sentences for countless women trapped miles from help or justice. Wives discovered that their husbands wielded absolute power over their bodies and lives, with no authority willing or able to intervene in their suffering. The territorial justice system treated wife-beating as a husband's prerogative rather than a crime, viewing women as property that men could discipline as they saw fit. This sanctioned brutality turned frontier homes into torture chambers where screams disappeared into the endless prairie wind. James Patterson's case in Montana Territory during 1887 exposed the horrifying reality of frontier justice. His wife Sarah endured months of savage beatings that left her face permanently disfigured and her ribs repeatedly broken. Neighbours occasionally heard her desperate cries echoing across the valley, but considered intervention an unthinkable violation of marital privacy. The final beating occurred on a bitter February morning when Sarah accidentally burned Patterson's breakfast. He struck her head repeatedly with a cast iron skillet until her skull cracked like an eggshell. Sarah collapsed to the cabin floor, blood pooling beneath her shattered face, as her life drained away over the course of several agonizing hours. Patterson buried his wife behind their cabin and reported her death as an accident caused by falling downstairs that did not exist. When territorial authorities finally investigated 3 weeks later, they found Sarah's shallow grave and her crushed skull that told a different story. The trial became a mockery of justice. Patterson's defence argued that his wife's defiant behaviour had provoked reasonable disciplinary action that unfortunately went too far. The all-male jury deliberated for less than an hour before declaring Patterson innocent of murder, ruling that a husband's right to discipline his wife superseded her right to live. Divorce offered no escape for battered wives, requiring proof of extreme cruelty that territorial courts rarely acknowledged. Women who fled abusive marriages faced starvation, exposure, or death from wild animals in the wilderness. Most discovered that returning to their tormentors offered better odds of survival than attempting escape. The frontier's violent culture normalized brutality as a solution to domestic disputes. Men who would never strike another man in town thought nothing of beating their wives, unconscious behind closed doors. The isolation that trapped couples together created pressure cookers of rage that exploded into deadly violence with terrifying regularity. Women learned to hide their bruises, apologize for their husband's violence, and accept beatings as the price of shelter and protection. The romantic ideal of frontier marriage dissolved under the reality that many wives lived as prisoners in their own homes, counting each day they survived as a small victory against inevitable death. Childbirth, pregnancy on the frontier, transformed into a death sentence that wives faced with terrifying regularity, where bringing life into the world meant gambling with their own survival in the most brutal lottery imaginable. The absence of trained physicians and medical supplies turned childbirth into a barbaric ordeal that claimed women's lives with horrifying frequency. Frontier wives endured endless cycles of pregnancy, birth, and recovery, in conditions that would have appalled medieval peasants. Most women faced 7 to 9 pregnancies during their marriages, each one rolling dice with death while isolated miles from any medical assistance. Catherine Morrison's final pregnancy in Wyoming Territory during 1876 revealed the savage reality of frontier childbirth. When her labour pains began on a frozen January morning, her husband Robert rode desperately through blizzard conditions searching for the nearest midwife, who lived 23 miles away across treacherous mountain passes. Catherine laboured alone for 6 agonising hours before Robert returned empty-handed, defeated by impassable snowdrifts that had trapped him miles from help. Her screams echoed through their cabin as contractions tore through her body, while her terrified husband watched helplessly, possessing no knowledge of childbirth beyond what he had observed with farm animals. The baby finally emerged after 14 hours of torture. But Catherine's bleeding refused to stop. Robert pressed every cloth and blanket against the crimson flow that poured from his wife's body, but frontier cabins possessed no surgical instruments, no sterile supplies, no medicines that could halt the hemorrhaging that was stealing her life. Catherine remained conscious as death approached, whispering final messages for the children she would never see grow up. Her blood soaked through the mattress onto the cabin floor, while Robert held her increasingly cold hands and watched the woman who had travelled across the continent to marry him fade into deathly pallor. She died as the sun set on her third day of labour, 18 hours after delivering the son who would never know his mother's face. Robert buried Catherine in the frozen ground behind their cabin, marking her grave with a crude wooden cross that bore only her name and the year that claimed her life. Catherine's tragedy repeated itself across thousands of frontier settlements, where women died in agony while their families watched helplessly. Infection killed those who survived the initial bleeding, as unsanitary conditions and contaminated instruments introduced deadly bacteria into traumatized bodies already weakened by blood loss and exhaustion. The frontier's brutal mathematics meant that marriage for women included accepting near certain death during their childbearing years. Each pregnancy became another spin of the roulette wheel, where survival meant defying odds that claimed their neighbours, sisters and friends with merciless regularity in the unforgiving wilderness.